And during the webinar, the team and I will be monitoring that chat, and Sam and others will be able to answer questions as we go through. So without further ado, I'll introduce Sam Kingsley. Sam works with the Brainery, which is one of DLTV's industry partners. Sam will talk a bit more about his background when he gets started, but yeah, I welcome you, Sam, and take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to present on robotics and the digital technologies curriculum. So I'll just get started. All right, here we go. So before we get into the presentation and the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, that's the Wurrung people, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So for today, this is what I'll be working through, and there'll be a couple opportunities for some comments and questions and feedbacks from all of you, and I'm really keen to see your questions and feedback. We'll start by I wanted to give you a bit of a background on who I am and who the Brainery is, and hopefully by doing that, give you a better understanding of my perspective on robotics and the Digitech curriculum. Then I wanted to give you an idea of how I've seen the changing landscape of robotics in education through my professional experience in the last 5-6 years. And then looking at the sort of pedagogical side of using robotics in an educational context, and looking at some examples of some robotics and how I look at robotics within the context of the classroom. Looking at some curriculum areas that we can apply robotics within, and then a couple of case studies of how I've assisted other schools with implementing robotics within their curriculum. And to finish things off, just a couple of thoughts around the challenges and opportunities that we have at the moment around using robotics within the classroom, and some questions at the end. So by way of background, the Brainery, we're a supplier of educational technologies across Australia, and that can range from robotics right through to touchscreens, disability and assistive technology, and also into counselling and therapy resources. Myself, my area of focus is within technology, and my background from a professional perspective is I've been working with robotics in schools since about 2015. So about 5 years of practice there, helping our customers implement the robotics that they purchase through us, and also helping them design units of work that will utilize those robotics in a meaningful way for them. I think my background is a unique one, or is a useful one when we're looking at robotics, because I don't have a mechatronic or engineering background. My background is in social sciences. So when I started working with robotics, I was coming from the perspective of someone who hadn't actually worked with a robot before. So everything at the time was brand new. So I've gone through those teething issues and the experience of troubleshooting when you don't really know what's going on, and having to learn and build your practice from scratch. So I think having that, starting from scratch and building my experience in that way, I can really empathize with anyone along that journey, whether they're starting from scratch or they're quite experienced and wanting to take digital technology and robotics to the next step. I was really happy to be able to do a graduate certificate of STEM Ed last year to kind of cement my learning and practice around using STEM technology within the classroom. But now I'd like to move into just looking at the sort of the changing landscape of robotics in education over the last few decades. So it's changed from my perspective quite a bit, but I think the key purpose of robotics hasn't necessarily changed all that much. I'm not sure how familiar our audience would be with Seymour Papert. I'm sure plenty of you would know him and his work, but the main thing that I took away from my studies into his work was that robotics really provide a way to engage students in problem solving and encourage them to change their perspective as learners in regards to STEM subjects, so science, maths, technology, and engineering. And by having a physical representation of the mathematics and the science that they're learning and seeing it actually happen in front of them really helps build authenticity into their learning and really is able to engage them in a meaningful way. So I think that underlying purpose is still central to what we're trying to achieve with using robotics within an educational context. There are other, I guess, areas that are worth considering. I don't want to go into them too much today, but I guess looking at how robotics will influence society and that sort of relevance of robotics and how the development of robotics from a application perspective outside of education into the sort of day-to-day lives and business, I guess is relevant in that our students will end up working in those industries at some point. So just touching on the current landscape of robotics in education, I like to look at robotics within, I guess, the marketplace through a few different lenses so that I can kind of work out their value for use within the classroom. And one way that I like to look at it is in the context of hackability. So how hackable is the robot and how much am I able to repurpose this robot for what I want to do within the classroom? So whether that be from a hardware perspective, so if we're looking at, say, a modular robotics platform where I can actually build in different form factors, shapes, sensors, and servo motors so that I can create something different, or whether it's from a software perspective in that I can program my robot in multiple different languages, and I can program quite complex things and quite simple things at the same time. So having that broad spectrum of options in regards to how I'm going to use my robot is something that I like to take into account. Alongside that, and I think that feeds quite nicely into the practicality of actually using it in a classroom. And I think the practicality within the classroom is something really important, because if we're taking a robot into the classroom and we're starting to sync up different technologies together, if we start to have issues with them syncing up and working as we intend them to, it can be quite disjointing to our class, and potentially we can lose students and lose their engagement. So making sure that when we say go with a specific robotics platform to use within our classroom, that we're able to put in place the procedures and the knowledge so that if something does go wrong, we can keep our lesson on track and we can keep our students engaged. So with that in mind, what I wanted to do is have a look at two examples within a primary school context. So I'm sure all of us have seen and probably had a go working with a Sphero robot. So within the two lenses of practicality and sort of hackability, I think Sphero is a good example where it's quite ubiquitous. We've all heard and seen them, but it's quite easy to see its hackability in the sense of it is a robot that from a hardware perspective, we are limited. We can't add anything more. It is locked in that hardened plastic case. But from a practicality position, is really useful because we can connect and sync up to its programming app on a tablet quite simply and easily. And with that in mind, we can take it and implement it quite quickly within a classroom, just making sure that our robot is fully charged and our devices are fully charged. On the other hand, I've got a second example here, the Kubo robot, which is a new player in the sort of primary early years STEM robotics side of things, which looks at things in a different lens, where when we're looking at the sort of practicality side of things, we don't necessarily need to have a device with this robot. So then that can make things a little bit easier. But then when we're looking at the robot from its different components, we can see that the robot's got different tiles, which, again, from that practicality side of things, if we start losing or misplacing these, it can make it difficult to continue working with the robot here. But the simplicity of this may make it easier to implement than, say, Sphero, or vice versa. So, but these two here are probably limited in their hackability because we can't change any of our hardware, and we are limited in our programming and software to block coding with the Sphero and a little bit of scripting there. But with our CodeBot here, we are specifically just blocks of code in our you can see our tiles running across in front of it. So there will be specific commands for that robot in this case. So that's, I guess, how I'm looking at those robots from within the context of two primary examples. From a secondary perspective, the two robots that I wanted to have a look at from that practicality and sort of hackability perspective is the Lego Mindstorm and the Now robot. So from a cost perspective as well, you're looking at significant differences there. When we start looking at, say, for example, the Now robot, the hackability from a software perspective is really high. So when we're in a secondary context, that would mean that we can actually push the development from a software perspective quite significantly to the point where we'd be looking at what would be applied within a tertiary context, so within a university or higher education context. But then from a hardware perspective, we can't physically change anything on this robot. Conversely, when we look at, say, the Lego Mindstorm there, as you can see, it's a modular system. So it does give us the opportunity to build and recreate and create our own types of robots based on the application that we'd like to use it for. So within the curriculum, if we're looking at those two there, the Mindstorm and a modular robotic system could be seen as being more useful within a design tech perspective, because we can actually look at designing a robotic solution to a problem. So then we're actually looking at the design side of things alongside the robotics and how the robotics could apply within that set context. So we can give a project-based learning aspect there and have both a hardware and software element for our students to create that solution there. If we were to look at, say, a project-based learning option with a humanoid robot that is fixed in its form factor, like the Now robot here in the example here, we're going to be limited to the software in the sense of what we can change and program and create. So what I'm trying to, I guess, look at here is the limitations and the positives within different platforms, and keeping those in mind, I think, will allow you to look at how you can use these robotic tools meaningfully in your specific classroom and context. Before I push on too much further, what I'd like to do is ask your feedback, and I'm just going to move across into a Mentimeter. So I'm hoping that you do have a web browser open. You can navigate to www.menti.com, and if you can use the code 845205, you'll be able to log in. And I've got two questions that just wanted to get your feedback on and get your answers, so we can get an understanding of what sort of robots you're using at the moment and how you might be using them. Cool. So it seems we have an overwhelming majority of us that are using or have used robotics in the classroom, which is really cool. Wonderful. Thank you for giving us your feedback on that. I'm going to move on to our next question just to take a little bit further. So just wanted to get an idea about which robots you've used in the classroom, and if you'd like to add any sort of experiences around those robots with your answer, you're more than welcome to. But just love to hear what sort of robots you've been using.
Sorry, Sam, I was going to jump in and chat with you here at this moment, and then my computer decided to just reboot all of a sudden. So, yeah, it's great to see a good range of robots that people have used there. I can see ones there that would be suitable for primary as well as for secondary settings.
Definitely. I think it's good to see that there is a bit of variety in there, that we are looking at different platforms, because I think it's good to learn how different robotics are programmed, because at the end of the day, if we, I guess, are able to develop an understanding of how to program and how to work with robots, it is fairly applicable across different platforms.
Mm. Yeah, one of the other considerations that often comes up with robots as well is how you make it work in terms of storage and just those logistical things in your school. Schools might have a trolley, or you might have a cupboard or a way of storing them. But with robots that you construct, you can also have the issue of, how am I going to timetable this so that my students from different classes can still get a chance to build the basic robot, or you know, program it. And that's one of the reasons, I think, for the popularity of the ones that are solid based and are not built, because of that, just that logistical issue.
Definitely. And I think when you've got multiple classes that you're wanting to deliver the robotics in, and you've got budget constraints to make sure that you can actually, if you're buying one platform, you've got, you know, say a class set, how can you make sure that you can use them across all the year levels or all the classes that you want to? So I think you're right about having, you know, ones that are fully formed that you don't have to deconstruct can be, I guess, easier to move across when you've got those time constraints placed upon you.
Just before we go on, I'm fascinated to hear more about the farm bot. So whoever put that in, I know what it is, but I'd love to hear how it works in your school. If you want to mention in the chat, it sounds awesome. Yeah.
I think they should be able to add another answer if they want, and it should be able to pop up on the screen, so if they're happy to share.
Cool.
I think another element around the practicality that I think is worth mentioning as well is when we're using a robotics platform that requires connection to a computer or another, a third-party device to actually, I guess, write that code and run that code, then we get all sorts of other sort of IT aspects that we need to think about and work through. And as I guess, just making sure that you've got the IT department on board to assist with any connections and working through any software that may have to, access the network or things like that can also be a bit of a hiccup.
Yeah, I remember when I worked with robotics in the classroom in a secondary setting, I was always jealous of the science teachers because they had a tech that would help them set up their test tubes and things like that before the class. Whereas I was always, standing around packing up all the robots and trying to put things away and trying to set things up into my recess on lunchtime. So I feel like robotics teachers should get a tech like science teachers do.
Definitely.
I'll let you get on, Sam, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. I'll move back to our slides, and we can keep rolling from here. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was from looking at the robotics from a pedagogical side of things. So I'm not sure whether or not we're, I guess, familiar or working within the ideas of the pedagogical content knowledge from Schulman, but I found both pedagogical content knowledge and TPAC, technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge a useful way to look at technology within professional practice from the context of a classroom teacher, in that we, by being in the classroom, use a whole heap of technology that is technology that we don't really, we kind of take for granted, in that depending on when we first jumped into the classroom, we'll be using electronic whiteboards and different bits and pieces and different computing technologies in there. But when we have technological tools that kind of disrupt our way of teaching in our practice, that can be, I guess, a bit of an issue, and it can cause the abandonment of technology, and in this case can cause the abandonment of robotics. What I have seen from my professional experience is that when, and inevitably we do have this, we have people that will move and leave organizations just the same as we would have in schools. Teachers will move schools and may even leave the profession, but as we have professionals coming and going, we lose knowledge. And I've seen robotics that was being implemented really successfully, and then that person moved on to another school, and then the robotics became a technological tool that was more of a disruption, more of an issue for the teachers that took on that role afterwards. So I think being able to look at technology as just another area of knowledge and another area of, I guess, pedagogical knowledge, to make it a more useful, practical part of teaching was really useful for me. And I think having a look at the TPAC framework is a good way to sort of incorporate technology into your professional practice. So I'd recommend having a bit more having a deep dive into TPAC if you're interested. I don't think it's necessarily an issue of looking at, say, the other iterations of TPAC and saying, one is better than the other. I think at the end of the day, as long as it's useful for you to apply it to your practice, then I don't think it matters which sort of framework you end up using, as long as it's relevant and useful to you, because we're all in different contexts, and I think that's the most important aspect of it. So from a curriculum perspective, I've found that when working with robotics that naturally the Digitech and Design Tech are the umbrellas from a curriculum perspective where they would fit best. But depending on the robot that you're using and the context, the reason why you apply them in those areas may vary. What I've also found is when we're working in, say, primary versus secondary context, there's very different ways of applying the robotics. So from a primary school perspective, because we're more likely to be using, I guess, an integrated way of teaching our students, we can look at using robotics in a more cross-curricular way. And if we take the example of for example, a Sphero robot, we can be quite creative with that robot in the way that we have our students working with it. So it can be looking at how we're actually getting data and information from that robot and how we're sending that robot data and information, but also looking at in a creative way. So a great example I saw of this was a school in Queensland was using a Sphero within the context of disaster management and disaster relief. So they built a sort of course where they had disasters within the city from a flood, and they took the form factor of the Sphero, the shape of the Sphero, and the students were required to design a capsule, an automated capsule based on that size and shape to work within that environment. So the students would design the capsule to collect people who are in trouble, and then using the Sphero, they'd program it to move around that small miniature-sized city that had those obstacles in the way. So they started to look at it from trying to creatively build more into the robot than just the physical hardware and software that we had there. So I think when we look at it creatively like that, we can build in that cross-curricular element. When we start looking at it from a secondary context, because we start seeing more silos in regards to different subject areas, it becomes more of an area where robotics is taught in isolation, and it can limit our ability to go cross-curricular there, and it can mean that we have to get significant sort of support from both leadership and our other department teachers to get cross-curricular happening there. So I think when we're in the secondary context, it is more likely that we're going to get success with the Digitech and Design Tech from a sort of, a subject focus area. But ideally, we can try and push it a bit further into a bit more sort of integrated robotics, integrated STEM perspective. What I'd like to do next is talk about a couple of examples, a couple of case studies of robotics and design. And I hope in that way I can sort of apply what we've been talking about in a bit more detail and make it a little bit more real. So a school that I've had the pleasure of working with is the Knox school on the east side of Melbourne. And they've got a class set of robots, which should be about, I think, about 12 easy robots, which you can see just on the screen here. They're a modular-based robotics platform that you clip together and then program. But I guess the interesting way that they've looked at using these robots is they've actually created a trial unit where they're combining different subject areas together. And with that in mind, it's not, say, for example, just a robotics subject. It's in this subject, you're going to spend time learning about robotics. You're going to spend time learning about visual communication design, media, arts. And it's almost like the robotics is a skill. It's a tool. It's a way for the students to actually work on a project based on sustainability. So the students are given the freedom to identify a topic, an area that is meaningful to them, but has to be related to sustainability. And after they've completed the units on robotics, art, visual design, and media, they can actually say, okay, to solve this problem, to complete my project, I'm going to use some robotics, and I'm going to focus on some of the skills that I learned in media. And that's, and you know, the rationale of why I'm going to do this is X, and that's part of the capstone that they're working on and presenting in that way. So the aim for those students within that context is for them to apply their learning in an open-ended format. So I guess it seems to be more of an engineering sort of design focus, where they're actually finding a problem and breaking the problem down to find and design a solution to solve that problem. And they have scaffolding around it to focus them and get them thinking about sustainability, but they have the freedom to decide on how they want to attack that problem and which problem they want to actually solve. The next example, which is a project that I've been working on and is in its, I guess, the final stages of implementation at the moment. And I think it's a really creative and innovative way of looking at remote learning. So we've been working with the Wyndham Tech School in the west of Melbourne around delivering a remote robotics learning experience for the schools that are part of the Wyndham Tech partnerships. So schools that joined the challenge, their students were sent home or had robots delivered to them at home so that they could actually keep engaged and working on Digitech based curriculum. So from, I guess, a practicality sort of perspective of how that all worked, each student would receive their own robot, and they had 4 or 5 sessions with facilitators to work them through different skills and different parts of the project that they were working on. Now, the project they were working on was based around a real-world application where they would program their robot to act as a sort of customer service helper assistant robot within a hospital, so that when someone presented to a hospital, the robot would recognize them, recognize their face, that they're a human, and start engaging with them to guide them to where they needed to go within the hospital and provide information based on what they were wanting to do in the hospital, whether they're a patient, whether they're a visitor, or an alternative category. And the way that it was structured was that each week, the students would have a session with the facilitators and would focus on a specific skill or a specific element of the robot that would then come together to form the basis of their challenge and what they needed to program in with the requirements. So I think one of the really wonderful elements of this was that because we were working with students who were at home, once they had that session with us, the first session or the following sessions, they had this physical resource with them at home. So they had the opportunity to play with this robot and muck around with this robot. So they got sort of guidance and facilitation around how this robot works and what skills we wanted them to try and learn in that session. But then they had a whole week to actually be at home with this robot and really test it out and, you know, at their own pace, which I thought was really cool, because I think one of the important parts of using a robot within an educational context is fun, and making sure that, you know, the reason we use these is they're so engaging and you get children wanting to learn and change their thinking around who they are as a learner. And if we lose that fun, I think we lose some of the importance of using a robot within an educational context. So aside from giving them that extra time to work with this robot in their own time and having that free time, it's really fascinating how the remote learning played out from the perspective of having robots at home, working with those students by themselves, and then coming into school once the restrictions started to ease. So we didn't necessarily, it was hard to judge, we didn't see too much peer-to-peer learning when we were in that remote setting. But as soon as they were in the classroom, we saw some really wonderful engagement and sort of student learning, where our role was really to take a step back and let them teach each other. So we saw, you know, friends who hadn't seen each other for, you know, months, just working on their robot projects together, and had this really amazing collaboration and just talking about, oh yeah, I had trouble with this, you know, how did you do it? And getting that peer learning, which was really beautiful to see. But I think it's also worth mentioning that whilst we had some really interesting outcomes and that sort of wonderful learning, there's also plenty of challenges working with robotics at home with students, when we have lots of different potential devices, and making sure that you know, you've got different infrastructure within a classroom versus a home environment, and I guess that comes back to the practicalities that Nathan and I were talking about before, where the setup and facilitation is all remote. So students are actually doing their own setup and having to learn how to troubleshoot themselves rather than having a teacher or a tech on hand to assist them. So I think both had its positive, its negative in there. So, I mean, some students really took that and ran with it and demonstrated a real desire to troubleshoot and learn themselves, which was really cool and wonderful to see. But no doubt there probably was some students who didn't take that up, and that's just part and parcel of working in a remote environment. It can be really difficult to get feedback on how students are doing when your only communication is through a screen.
I was going to say, Sam, I think that's really interesting, kind of from what you were talking about before about Seymour Papert and that sort of idea of learning by doing. And then this has kind of been a situation where at least some of the students have really had to do that just on their own and do that learning by doing. And then you've been able to see the way it's come back together when they've come back. So that's a really useful experiment to look at that pedagogy and that sort of way of learning.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, well, I mean, with most of these students, they selected this. So I guess from that context, you would expect that those students would have that desire already to learn about robotics and technology. But I think it pushed them in regards to becoming maybe a little bit more resilient with technology, because they had it there and they were problem solving themselves without necessarily hands-on support.
Yeah, that's great.
So the next thing that I wanted to have a quick look at is some of the challenges that we have at the moment in regards to embedding and implementing robotics within Australian classrooms. And the key thing that seems to be coming up, and my experience mirrors this as well, is that teacher training and PD is the #1 thing that we need to build on. So from the research that I've been engaging with, is around 26% of teachers in a secondary context are teaching out of field when they're teaching science, technology, engineering or maths. And then alongside that, 23% of primary teachers have no formal tertiary studies in either maths or numeracy. So these sort of factors coming into making sure that we're prepared to teach, whether it's those STEM subjects or the Digitech or Design Tech curriculum, is really important. And I think focusing on the human element gets sometimes lost with the narrative around technology in the classroom. I think the technology industry has always had a very good marketing spend. So they have very persuasive and can articulate some really wonderful ideas around using technology. But at the end of the day, we're not at the point where we've got intelligent robots that can teach a class. It's still the human element within the classroom that really dictates whether we've got success or failure with using technology, be it robots or something else within the classroom. So I think the research backs up my experience personally, and I think I'd say that you probably would agree there that we need to invest in our people to make sure that we're able to teach our students the really important skills that they get out of the Digitech and Design Tech curriculum. So with that in mind, what I guess I'm referring to is those 21st century skills of thinking critically and working through problems, breaking them down into smaller problems and doing that problem solving. It's not necessarily just about learning to code or learning to work with a robot. It's learning those skills and applying them to meaningful contexts. So I guess that's where I see the challenges at the moment. The other thing, I guess, alongside that is the design tech and digitech curriculum are relatively new. We've only had them in the curriculum since 2015, and in one sense, it's making it a little bit harder because we've got a growing curriculum and we've got to find ways to fit that in. My argument around that is it's much easier said than done, but trying to find ways to implement cross-curricular units of work where hopefully we can minimize that growing curriculum burden and spread it out and apply it together so that we can hopefully be more efficient with our time. But that can be really quite difficult to do. So it's definitely not a silver bullet there. Now, I think we're in a very interesting time and place at the moment with the COVID crisis. And I think there's a nice silver lining that I'm starting to see coming through with the schools that I work with, is that we've got an opportunity from what's happened with COVID, in that for term 2, all of us have done a lot of remote work with students, and to successfully do remote work, we have to be using and embracing technology. So I think there's a bit of momentum here, and I think that matches up with I think the growing number of members of DLTV, that we're all getting forced to use technology and learn by doing. So I think what we were talking about before with learning by doing with robotics has been happening with technology in general with remote learning. And I think because we've got that happening, there's a wonderful opportunity to build on that momentum and to encourage those teachers who are embracing technology to continue to do so now that we're moving back into the classroom and more into some form of normality. So I think at this point in time, we have a chance to really push the technology use within our classrooms in a meaningful way. So people are actually going to see it as a technological tool to help with professional practice and learning, rather than sort of an opaque technology that may disrupt what we're trying to actually achieve in the classroom. So I've basically covered most of what I wanted to talk about today, but I wanted to open it up to any questions, thoughts or comments that you have as the audience in regards to robotics within the classroom, and I guess more broadly as well, technology within the classroom.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I did notice one question came up from Angela. Can we get the reference on the percentage of teachers? I think that might have been your third point, just on that that previous slide.
Yeah. So the reference around the out of field teaching came from the ASA policy insights. So from 2016, out of field teaching in Australian secondary.
And
then,
that would, yeah, sorry.
And sorry, I think there was also from the challenges in STEM learning in Australian schools. So to be from those two.
Are there any other questions from anyone for Sam? Maybe you'd like to, put in something that you've found really successful in your teaching of robotics, or in the use of that tool. It'd be great to hear from you. I was going to ask you, Sam, that issue of handover that you talked about, and how a lot of schools, and I think we've all seen this happen with robots in schools, where that handover doesn't take place, and then something that was initially very costly ends up in a box or in a cupboard somewhere. What would be your insights on that? Have you seen things that work? I noticed that someone did post, Jane posted in the chat, that she uses OneNote to do kind of documents on all of the technologies that's at the school. So that would go some way to help, I think, if a new teacher was coming in.
Yeah, I think there's it's a really tough one, because I think organisations as a whole experience this just across the board. Just having someone change roles, you lose it no matter what. But I think one thing that we found useful from both a sort of an educational perspective, but also working with sort of disability and assistive tech, is having as many people as possible to participate in training. So that, and having it make you a bit more visual, and so that you know, if say for example a school has spent you know, significant money on a class set of robotics, or one robot maybe, something, you know, like when I was talking about before, now robot is probably around $15,000 to $20,000. So that if you're spending that amount of money, if it just ends up in a cupboard, it seems like a real waste of resources. So I think having as many people part of that training, and also having it as something that is quite visual, or you know, it's easily seen as part of the school. I think something that was quite fascinating was I think it's Western Port Secondary College. They were implementing now robots, and they actually had a big banner of a now robot with their logo on, I think, the school gym. So it's very visual. Everyone knew that it was part of what they were doing, and something that was significant and part of their school. So I think it became central to what they were trying to achieve. So I think, yeah, having extra resources available is always wonderful, but also having it as a really central and visual part of the culture at the school, I think, can help too with you know, losing expertise and people changing position. Another interesting example that I found was a tech that was working with some robotics platforms that we'd supplied actually moved into a teaching role. So it was quite wonderful that rather than losing his expertise, he brought it into the classroom and actually probably increased the knowledge that was available to students with, so I think that went the opposite way, which was really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. I've also heard suggestions of you know, like working more closely. In fact, I think, Deb, we were talking about this, how a lot of schools, the way they set up their IT management means that it often the person who has to do it is a little bit under resourced or time wise, and all you get is that sort of the contractor perhaps, and you don't often have a teaching staff member who's able to interface with those people.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a real challenge actually for primary schools, in having people. I mean, you've spoken about this and that people are working out of field, but it's certainly a challenge, particularly in primary schools, for people to coordinate their efforts around what to do and make sure that any expenditure is a wise expenditure, and have the time to invest in that, and even knowing what's available, particularly in the F2 area with robotics. Have you done much around that area with robotics?
I've done a small amount with the F2. To be honest, most of my work has been with upper primary and secondary. But the small work that I have done with that has just taught me that you need to be very, what's the word? It's got to be very quick, sharp, and engaging. There's not much downtime. So I think, you know, with that in mind, you need to have a robotic tool, if you're going to use one at that level, that is able to keep those kids engaged with short, sharp activities. Yeah. So I guess that means that you need something that is probably like a, as I think Kelly just popped up in the chat, like an Edison or a or something like that, that is just, you know, you take it out of the box and you're good to go, rather than something that needs a bit more setup time.
Yeah.
We'll sort of formally call an end to the formal part of the presentation now, but we do want to thank everyone for coming in, and especially thank Sam. I'll reiterate what Kev said Thank you for coming, and thanks, Sam, for presenting.
Just going back to what we were discussing there around the F2 range, I've seen a few robots that are coming out that have taken the idea of screenless coding, and I think that's a really good way of building in coding into the curriculum and taking away that screen time. I think that's a really innovative way of looking at coding, because when we have that physical sort of creation of code, and when students can get quite tactile with it, I think it can be a bit broader, the appeal. We may lose some students when we're just using digital tech to program our robots and they have to use a screen. I think when you can make it really tactile, that we might be able to keep hold and engage the whole class. And I like that when it's tactile like that, there is opportunity to push it into other areas. For example, I think having tactile programming elements has been really useful for sort of a special education context as well. Yeah,
I was just, Deb was suggesting like Cubeto. I was thinking also the Ozobots can be done in that way too, where you just set them down and they can program themselves based on colors that are drawn in the lines. What other, did you have another couple in mind that you were thinking of, Sam, from that point of view, tangible?
I think the Cubeto and the Kubo are the ones that that I had in mind. I have seen some creative ways of trying to take sort of robotics where you do need a device to program, and actually sort of printing out different bits of code, blocks of code, and laminating them so that it became a bit more of a tactile and immersive lesson where students who may not have the dexterity to actually use a computer could actually write some code by pulling together the visual elements of the programming software in a physical way, which was really cool. Like I remember, I think it was